Hello everyone, greetings for the day. Welcome to another tutorial of ISTQB Foundation examination. So in the previous tutorial we were talking about the 7 testing principles, whereas in this tutorial we'll be looking into the next topic, which is related to the fundamental test process. So here the entire fundamental test process will be discussed at K1 level. The certification involves understanding of the fundamental test process from the perspective of activities being conducted as a part of the fundamental test process. So let's quickly look into the stages involved here and the activities which are being performed as a part of it. So the fundamental test process has basically the 5 stages, where it includes test planning and control, test analysis and design, test implementation and execution, evaluating exit criteria and reporting, and test closure activities. So ISTQB says that these activities are put together to a certain extent, which is basically to conduct these activities at a parallel mode. So when we say the term parallel, it basically means that the test planning as it is going on, the alternatively or parallelly we prepare the control actions for each planned activities. So similarly it goes with the test analysis and design, where the ongoing activities keep happening, and also to a certain extent test implementation and execution, where the similar thing happens, like how you prioritize the test cases and all. Parallelly you start with execution, and meanwhile again you deal with prioritizing some other test cases. So we will be looking into the detail of all these stages here, one after the other, and also trying to work with the activities being involved as a part of it. So let's get started with it and understand how the things takes place as a part of it. So let's look into the very first stage of test planning and control. We have got test planning here and also something called as test control. So let's understand each one of them and then move into like why they are put together, or what are the context behind that. So when you talk about test planning, it's basically a task of the test manager, where test manager does the test planning for the entire testing life cycle, where there are several activities which are conducted as a part of it, where it begins with defining the entire scope of testing, defining the objective of testing. Following that, we also look into that several other activities like allocating the roles, defining the responsibilities, also determining the entry and exit criteria. Entry and exit criteria are certain type of checklist which basically helps to define that when a test level must begin and test level must exit or stop. It can be also created overall, like for the entire testing life cycle, that when testing should start and when we can say that testing can be stopped. So these exit criteria are prepared during the test planning phase, but evaluated at the respective stages. As we move ahead, we can look into that. Beyond that, obviously, defining and determining the different stages, that when the other stages would begin, and where it will be aligned with the other activities of the projects. For example, when the documents are being prepared, the test manager must be involved to decide that whether my team will be available at that point of time to conduct the reviews on the documentation or not. So on the other side, when you talk about the codes being released from the development team for the testing, and my testing team must be available with all the test cases well prepared by that point of time. So as a part of test planning, test manager also takes the responsibility of assigning or aligning the activities, those of testing, with the development life cycle. Beyond that, we do also define on what kind of template will be used for the documentations, and also like what depth, whether it will be high level or low level, because depending on the project and project characteristics, you define the template, that the details of the content, that how detailed it will be, whether it will be high level or low level. Also, to a certain extent, we talk about the matrices, which helps you to monitor the entire process. We will come back to it. We'll talk about the test control here. The test controls are certain actions which are written by the test manager, which basically helps to create an alternative or any such kind of corrective action which can be taken if you think the plan is deviating from the schedule or as planned. So usually what happens when you do the planning, it's a very early stage or quite beginning of the testing life cycle where you do the planning. And it's not mandatory that the planning would go is as per like what you have planned, but at any point of time you can experience that the plan are getting deviated depending on the real time statistics or the evaluation and the progress measurement. So at that point of time you basically need some corrective actions to be taken, and that we recommend should be prepared parallelly with the test planning in the beginning itself. So as you plan any activity parallelly, you also define the control actions for each activity so that you can be ready for it at any point of time when you need them. So just a simple example where you say having a stepney in your car, when your car tire gets punctured on the way to somewhere, then you just have to calm down and take off your stepney and replace your tire and keep on moving. So that's where we talk about like the deviations which are being created from the plan should be curbed or mitigated as early as possible by using the control actions. But the question comes, when do we come to know that a test plan is getting deviated and it's time to implement a control action? That's with help of test monitoring is another term which helps you to measure the progress on the project. So the progress on the projects are measured throughout the testing life cycle, and it's also a medium to define the coverage and many other things. So basically we have 5 primary dimensions to be measured as a part of test monitoring. It's the coverage, the risk, the test, defect, and the confidence. So these primary dimensions will be elaborated more when you move to the advanced level, but as of now we just need to know that there's something called as test monitoring, which basically helps you to measure the progress on the project. Now the monitorings are basically done with help of test matrices. Now this test matrices are some kind of formulas, some kind of calculation, which basically helps you to define the measurement units. So for example, let's talk about execution rate. Execution rate is defined as one of the entity in the plan that, okay, when it comes to test execution, we'll be executing 10 test cases per day. And we select a matrix to measure that monitoring unit, that is test execution rate. So test execution rate, as you can see, is calculated based on the total number of test cases executed divided by total number of test cases planned for execution multiplied by 100. Now if you see here, maybe on the day 1, when it comes to test execution, basically you measure them on each day, or maybe what interval you have to define for it. So say on day 1 you executed 10 test cases over the 10 and you achieve 100% execution rate, whereas on the day 2 you see that, okay, fine, it is 10 on 10, day 3 10 on 10. But what if day 4 you see there's a 9 on 10, which is giving you only the 90% of the execution rate? Now that's how you come to know that now there's a need for the test control actions to be taken, because we are getting deviated from the schedule and it will grow as you proceed ahead without taking any corrective actions. So we just have to come back to control action, pick the relevant activity or control action and apply it there, and we just mitigate the deviation and come back to the schedule. So the control actions are basically something same, where it takes the help of test matrices and the test monitoring process, which helps you to decide on whether if a control action is required to be implemented or not. So putting it all together is like test planning is the entire approach of testing, which is defined with several other activities. Test controls are certain corrective actions which are written parallelly with test planning to be taken at any point of time where you see there's a deviation from the plan. And how will you come to know, how do you measure that if the control action is required to be implemented at any point of time? That is by doing test monitoring, which stands for the measure of the progress on the project. And this measure of the progress is done with help of, or the test monitoring is done with help of the test matrices, where test matrices are certain formulas certain calculations which help you to measure a particular entity at any point of time. So moving into the next, we have got the next stage as test analysis and design. So here again, we have got two important stages to be picked up. So before we begin with these stages here, we basically evaluate the entry criteria, which says that entry criteria must be met so that we can start with the testing life cycle. And as a part of it, we start reviewing the test spaces. So team, I have highlighted all the important terms wherever applicable throughout the entire preparation of the certification. So I really want you to be aware of all these important terminologies, because sometimes they can be asking you a straightforward question on these terms, or they will be quite frequently using these terms as a part of the question when they put it across to you. So reviewing the test basis, where the test basis basically stands for the documentation or any such reference which is used for testing. So reviewing the test basis in the sense like you start analyzing the test basis, like requirements, designs, workflows, control flow diagrams, algorithms, whatever you use as a reference can be called as test basis, and you start analyzing them and understanding them. As a part of analysis of these test bases, you also evaluate the testability of the test bases, like what requirements are testable, what requirements are untestable. For example, there are a few entities which are written in the requirement document, which you find it as like it cannot be covered in this particular release. So it is limited to that, and we are not having it in scope this time. So you basically mark those requirements as untestable, or the testability being negative, that we are not going to test it at this point of time. Also defining the test objects. Now what are test objects? Basically the typical functionalities or the features of those particular area. So when you talk about a requirement like login, the test objects to be tested there would be the functionality of the text fields, the buttons and the links, and so on. So test objects are basically what do you test as a part of any particular level or as a part of a particular requirement. What are the test areas? What are the test objects? And the test basis basically stands for any such requirement which has a reference to help you with the testing process. Also, as a part of test analysis, you identify and prioritize test cases. The test conditions. Now, when you talk about test conditions, the test conditions is equal to test scenarios. So as you are going through the requirements, you try to understand them. You parallelly identify the test conditions which are required to be tested. So for example, if I'm looking at an automated teller machine, the ATM software, then I try to identify the test scenarios as the withdrawal, the pin change, the mini statement, the balance inquiry. So now each one of these is basically called as a test conditions. Now test conditions can be taken care further or elaborated further as part of test cases. So you first try to identify the test conditions, and after identifying each test condition, you prepare test cases on that. When you talk about the next stage, test design, as a part of it itself, the same stage, that is second stage, test design completely deals with preparing the test cases and also prioritizing to a certain extent that what test cases will be executed in what order. Also identifying the necessary test data to support the test conditions and test cases. So test data is a set of all data what you'll be using to use it as a part of the test case execution. So all your test cases basically invite certain kind of data. So whenever there is a field involved where a user input is involved, a user is supposed to enter a value, the test data comes into picture, and preparing a valid set of data for any execution is equally important. So this is the phase in test design where we try to identify the test data to be used for the test cases. Designing the test environment setup. So this is the place again where you start preparing for the test environment, which will be used as a part of the test execution. So test environment is basically the configuration and the setup required for the application to be deployed on and then conduct the testing. Whereas also talking to a certain extent about the creating bidirectional matrices. When we say bidirectional matrices, a matrix which is evaluated from any direction, either column wise or the row wise. So usually we talk here about RTM. So RTM stands for requirement traceability matrix, where you know that requirement traceability matrix is a matrix which can be evaluated either column wise or row wise, where we say, have we covered all the requirement into test cases, or all my test cases are covering the requirements. So it can be either way, it can be evaluated either way. So we call it as a bidirectional matrices. So as a part of test design, we basically prepare the bidirectional traceability matrices, and we try to keep the ready template which can be used in the further stages. So putting it all together, test analysis and design is all about analyzing the requirements, that is the test basis, and preparing the test cases on that. As a part of it, you also identify the test conditions and preparing the test environment, acquiring the test data, identifying the test data to support your test cases, and also creating the bidirectional matrices. As we move further, we have got the next stage as test implementation and execution. In simple terms, when you talk about test implementation, is all about getting ready for execution or getting prepared for execution. Whereas when you talk about the execution, it's all about executing those test cases, what you have prepared as a part of test design. So if you look precisely when into the test implementation here, it deals with activities like finalizing, implementing, and prioritizing test cases. So in the previous stage, the test design, you're already done with preparing those test cases, but now you're trying to collectively put them together and sequence them based on the priorities like risk analysis, maybe the complexity involved, or maybe the criticality which is being part of the particular module, and based on that you try to prioritize the test cases, and even finalizing and prioritizing the test cases or so. When you look at another thing like developing and prioritizing the test procedures, that is where is when you talk about the word test procedure, which basically deals with the sequence of the execution, where you can say that how the particular transaction will be performed, where say you start with the launch of the application, logging into the application, then you search for a particular entity like fly from city, fly to city, enter the number of tickets, what you're looking for, and click on search button. The next page would be tested, will be the search criteria results, where it shows you the available flights. Then you select one flight, enter the passenger details, then you move to the payment, and then you get your itinerary. So defining this procedure would be equally important for the test cases to be aligned in the right sequence of the execution. And that's where we talk about developing and prioritizing the test procedures as well. Like for example, before you get into the login part, you must be conducting the registrations. So you can also define something like execution condition, where you can state that if the previous test passes, you should move to the next one. For example, if the registration scenario passes, then only you can execute the test cases for the login part. So you can also define the test execution dependencies, the execution flow, and entirely the modules with the right sequence called as the test procedures. Whereas creating the test suites from the test procedure for efficient test execution, where test suites basically stand for the test cases which are collectively put together at one place or put together for the execution. So when we call multiple test cases together and we declare it as one test suite, it means that when you start with the execution of one test suite, all the test cases of that suite must be executed together. You just can't interrupt your run or stop your run at any point of time in between unless all the test cases of that suite is executed. So it's can be any number of test cases. Basically, we normally have around 10 to 15 test cases as a part of it, which would be most relevant test cases put together for that particular module or maybe that particular requirement. So test suite is basically a collection of test cases put together. So if in case you are a user of ALM, you go to test lab, there you can see an option called as test set. The test set is basically what we call it as test suite. Verifying the test environment has been set up correctly. So yes, in test design, we were trying to create the environment. Now we make sure that if the environment has been deployed or set up correctly or not, so that we can begin with the execution. Also, the traceability matrix, what you had created in the previous stage test design, here we will be evaluating it. That is filling in the information and making sure that have we covered all the test cases in the or covering all the requirements in the test cases or not, which is just a kind of precautionary step that have we missed anything to be converted into test case. So putting it all together, test implementation basically deals with preparation to get for the test execution. Beyond that, there are many other activities as well, like you prepare the test scripts in test implementation, and also the implementing the test tools for the execution if in case you're going with automation. Coming to the next is test execution. Obviously, entire execution takes place here, right from the beginning of unit testing till the all non-functional levels and the acceptance testing. So all the execution takes place here, and you conduct them either manually or automatically using certain tools. You basically, as a part of execution, you execute the test cases, update the actual results, compare the actual results with the expected. If your test cases passes, it's good enough. In case it fails, you log the discrepancies as incidents. So basically, ISTQB says a discrepancy or a failure of test case is first reported as an incident by the test engineer, which is further requires evaluation by the test manager. And once the test manager finds it genuine or valid defect, then only the incident has been will be declared as a defect, and it will be used for further processing beyond that. So as a result of these defects being reported, the developer will follow the steps and do the root cause analysis and all to fix the defect. Once the defect is fixed, the module will be sent to you back again, where you rerun the same test case which failed, by which you found the defect exists, will be re-executed in terms of to confirm that if the defect is really fixed or not. So you call it as retesting. Retesting is all about executing a particular test case just to confirm that the defects have been fixed or not. Whereas regression testing is another term which basically helps you to uncover the areas which may be affected due to the change in the program. So usually what happens is, like, to fix that defect which you have reported, the developer would have made some changes to the program and would have modified certain codes which basically can impact, it's not mandatory, but to a certain extent it may impact the areas which were working fine earlier. So it's our responsibility to make sure that you rerun those test cases which were already executed and working fine, to make sure that after the fixation has been done for a particular defect, then the other part is still working fine. So I'm just telling you in a brief term. We'll be discussing in more detail when it comes to the chapter 2, where we have retesting and regression testing as in more detail. So what we mean to say now is, like, yes, test execution deals with all types of execution, including the functionals, non-functional levels, managing all the defects, making sure the defects are being fixed. As a result of fixation, we conduct retesting and regression testing. Beyond that, we'll be talking in more details about retesting and regression testing when we come to chapter 2. So from here, as of now, we will be talking only about this much, so which would be more than enough to understand and work from chapter 1. So once all the execution is complete, like all the levels have been executed, and you finally say that the complete execution, whatever you were supposed to do, has been executed, you come to the next stage, which is called as evaluating exit criteria and reporting. So when you say about evaluating exit criteria is a major stage, when we never spoke about evaluating entry criteria like as a major stage, because entering into the process was not so complicated, but calling off a particular process or stage is very important, because you declare that no more testing will be done hereafter. So evaluating exit criteria, where I told you about exit criteria being the checklist which defines whether we can stop testing now or not. So it's basically a thoroughness measure of what coverage you have done. Is there any residual defects remaining or residual risk which are remaining? Or you talk about the budget allocated to you. If you run out of the budget, you run out of the time, you have to stop testing. But at any point of time, if you think that there are something more which is required to be covered, like for example, there is a risk with a higher severity is yet to be covered, and you have enough budget and time to conduct that, then you can modify the exit criteria and continue the testing further, because exit criteria will be created as a part of test planning, but by the time you conduct everything, then you realize at the end that yeah, maybe something more has to be done with the beyond the schedules to give a better confidence and quality to the market. So we make sure we can also update to a certain extent that we are continuing further beyond the defined exit limit, and then you're allowed to basically modify, which will be taken finally as a decision of test manager, and based on that you can modify your exit criteria as well. As you evaluate and finally declare that you have exited the process and your testing is complete, now no more testing will be completed once you exit the testing phase. The only thing which happens next is preparation of the test summary report. The test summary report is basically prepared by the test manager, and it basically consists of all major activities which are conducted towards achieving the goals of testing. So we would have defined, remember we told about test planning that there are certain objectives which will be defined, the scope of testing which will be defined in the test planning. So in test summary report, we target all those major activities like test analysis, test design, test implementation, test execution. Summary of all these stages put together will be called as the test summary report. So we mentioned there the overall summarization of what activities, what major activities you have done, how many test cases you have executed, how many defects did you find, and what was the fixation rate, and all these things put together, what risk you have identified and how many risks you could mitigate, and those things put together, and basically it will be all oriented towards showcasing that we have met the goal, we have met the objective by conducting all these steps. So test summary report is basically all about this, and that's where we basically say that this is one of the last activities of our STLC model. But we do have certain activities which do takes place even when we are done with writing the test summary report. So there's something called as test closure activities, which we will understand following this. So let's look into that. So the last stage of fundamental test process is test closure activities, where basically these activities are conducted once you basically call off that my testing is all over, I have passed on all the artifacts to the maintenance team, and maybe to a certain extent I can also say that the release would have taken place. But parallelly, let the release take place and you conduct your own retrospective, and we call it as test closure activities, where you make sure that have you delivered all those planned deliverables. So putting it together as like the reports which we're supposed to write as a part of this process, have you written them? There are certain things which remain open. It's not that, for example, few of the defects which are marked deferred by the developer, that means that these defects will be fixed at a later point of time, maybe in upcoming versions. Then we must prepare the proper reports addressing those defects, that which version are you targeting to cover these defects and fix them. So this will be also a part of test closure activities. Documenting the acceptance of system, which basically means that the client would have conducted acceptance testing and has accepted the application, then on what grounds, because we do have a lot of multi-level acceptance of an application, like contractual acceptance, operational acceptance, or maybe it's just the functional acceptance or business acceptance. So what exactly are the different levels on which he has accepted the application? We document those as well. Beyond that, obviously the entire details what you have used, including the resources, the test cases, the tools, and everything put together is called as testware, and we finalize and archive that, which where finalizing means that what all things you will basically need and have been using it for the entire testing, and archiving is basically for the future reuse. Because when you talk about a particular application's release, the very next version, definitely you will be working on that again. So we secure it, we store it and archive it for future reuse. Whereas we also hand over the entire testware to the maintenance testing team, where maintenance team is held responsible for taking care of the application post-release, where the basic responsibilities or common responsibilities of the maintenance team would be to deal with upgrades, and migrations. So whenever they make an update, they would obviously be looking into all the testware, that what test data did you use, what resources you were utilizing, what tools have you used for the execution, so that they can also run the same with the automation, and what defects you were looking into, and which are the defects which were common and reproducible. So they take care of all those things. As a part of other things, when you talk about the analyzing lessons learned, yeah, the team can sit together and discuss on what common mistakes they have made, which could have been avoided or could have been minimized to certain extents, and people try to learn lessons out of it. So we always look into improvising ourselves, improvising the process, minimizing the mistakes, so that we increase towards the maturity of the organization and the process. So as a result of lessons learned, if implemented or taken into seriously, taking into seriously about the lessons learned, the test maturity of the process can be improved or improvised. So putting it all together, when you talk about the test closure activities, these are basically the activities which are collected together and put together, like the entire experience of the team working with consolidating the information from the facts and the numbers, including the writing the reports, documenting such an acceptance, and all those things put together as test closure activities. In agile, we basically call it as the retrospective. So the similar thing there, it happens and at the end of every iteration. In the traditional approaches like this, it happens once in the project end. So that's one of the things to be understood. And the final thing is the fundamental test process. So finally, it completes all the stages. We'll be having another topic 1.5, that is psychology of testing, to go through. Once we complete the last topic, we'll be looking into the sample questions from this chapter. And stay tuned for upcoming videos on ISTQB. Hope this video was quite helpful for you, and definitely you have learned something more about what you already were practicing. So stay tuned. In case you have not subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications about the new updates and new videos being added to the series. So till then, take care. See you soon with the new tutorial on the same series. Take care and happy learning.